So might the California wildfires be the catalyst for a renewed fight against climate change? This week's events in Los Angeles were the perfect storm of hurricane-force Santa Ana winds, drought conditions, overdevelopment, and a warming planet. Not to mention other factors exacerbating the disaster: the LA Fire Department's budget cuts, lack of controlled burns, and water supply issues that include a large reservoir in Pacific Palisades, which has been closed for nearly 1 year, leaving a whopping 117 million gallon water storage complex empty in the heart of one of the most ferocious wildfires. Among the unknowns, whether arson played any role in this catastrophe. With regard to the global response to this warming planet, it's been mired in political inertia, corporate lobbying, and lack of cooperation among nations. The resulting gaps in action have left the planet on track to warm well above the 1.5 or even 2.0 Celsius thresholds, which scientists say will lead to catastrophe. In fact, last year became the warmest year on record for the planet, beating out 2023. In the United States, we've succumbed to partisan fighting, and even when there's agreement, things move at, well, a glacial pace. Consider that in 2021, the bipartisan infrastructure bill allocated $5 billion to install electric vehicle chargers on highways, and yet nearly 4 years later, it has, quote, installed 19 charging stations in 9 states, according to the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, which serves as the program's technical resource. Meanwhile, insurance companies are feeling the heat, literally and financially. The wildfires are exposing a $1 trillion hole in hidden home value losses from fires and floods. In 2023, California experienced the 4th largest rate of insurance non-renewals nationwide, trailing Florida, Louisiana, and North Carolina. The Pacific Palisades section of Los Angeles has been ground zero since the fires began on Tuesday. Well, there, last year, national insurer State Farm issued notices to cancel 1,226 of 2,342 policies. That's an astounding 69.4% in one zip code, the 90272 zip code. No wonder so many Californians have had no choice but to turn to the FAIR Plan, the state insurance pool, which saw a doubling of its clients to nearly 500,000 in the past 5 years. But this is not just a California story. It's hitting nearly all of us where it hurts our wallets. Just look at this tweet from Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who'll join me in a moment, he of Rhode Island, who's leading the charge on economic risks and costs of climate change. Quote, climateflation. In 5 years, home insurance has increased more than 50%, and the rate is accelerating as climate-driven risks like flood and wildfire become worse and harder to predict. Unlike the housing finance system, which is largely regulated at the federal level, property and casualty insurance is regulated at the state level. The result is a patchwork of different regulations where premiums vary wildly due to state-by-state regulation. That, in turn, has incentivized economically dangerous behavior in some areas. Check out this map from the New York Times, which reveals higher insurance premiums for homeownership. The darker the color, the higher the premium. You can see the distorted rates, which is making homeownership unaffordable for many. Zero in on Oklahoma, covered in red, where buyers are paying a lot more for home insurance compared to the value of their homes, even though they don't have as much risk in places like California. This happens because California has laws in place that stop insurance companies from raising premiums too much, but states like Oklahoma have weaker rules so companies can charge more. It means that folks in places like Oklahoma are paying extra to help cover the costs of disasters in other states like California. The point being, we're all in this together. For the past 2 years, the Senate Budget Committee has been investigating insurers dropping coverage as a result of climate change. In December, the committee released a report on the climate-driven crisis. They predict the non-renewals driven by climate disasters will destabilize insurance markets that will in turn destabilize housing markets. The results could be a repeat of the 2008 housing crisis, something that Senator Whitehouse has called deadly serious. Here's the bottom line. The prospect of change coming from Washington is dubious, especially where President-elect Trump has denied, ridiculed actually, the idea of a warming planet. And the public has shown no reluctance to continue to build and live in areas repeatedly hit by wildfire and tropical storm, whether it's California, North Carolina, or Florida. But maybe change is coming in the form of depleted insurance companies no longer covering areas prone to extreme weather. And if they won't insure, then banks won't lend, leaving certain areas accessible only to the very few who can afford to purchase without a mortgage. How many will have to be uprooted before we realize we're in it together? Where sadly the cause of the California wildfires seems like it's destined to become a partisan football, here's today's poll question at Smerconish.com. Which is more to blame for the devastation we're seeing in California? Is it the climate change or government mismanagement of resources? Joining us now is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, who until recently was chair of the Senate Budget Committee. He is now the ranking member on the Committee of Environmental and Public Works. Thank you for being here, Senator. You heard my whole setup. What is most significant from your perspective, given how you've spent the last 2 years working on these issues?
I would say two things. I would say first, a long campaign of lies and disinformation by the fossil fuel industry is now colliding with the business model of the insurance industry, which requires it to accurately predict future risk. And this isn't just LA, the risk is increasing in Florida, as you mentioned, even states like Oklahoma. And the cascade that follows is this. Climate change makes risk to homeowners unpredictable, which makes home insurance either unaffordable or flat unavailable, which makes mortgages unavailable on that property or in that region. And with mortgages unavailable, property values crash, and the property values crash is predicted to be significant enough that it creates an economic cascade into the entire U.S. economy, just like 2008 did. And in fact, this is a global problem, leading the April issue of The Economist magazine, saying that climate change is shaking the foundations of the biggest asset class on the planet, real estate. So we're looking potentially at going off a very steep cliff here when the rate of insurance failure accelerates.
So I read the report of the Budget Committee. The way you've explained it and the report make perfect sense to me. But you know that some are watching, paying attention and saying, wait a minute, the reservoir was empty. The fire hydrants had no water. They're even going so far as to introduce DEI factors and questioning some of the hires that have been made among firefighters. You would say what to those people?
There is obviously a lot of nonsense that is going to be propagated by fossil fuel interests and the Republicans who are paid by fossil fuel interests. But if you look aside from just this fire, you also see fire risk and coastal flooding risk, and in case of Oklahoma, hail risk. The risks are increasing, and you can't blame the floods in Florida on a bad reservoir in California. There really is a risk profile that's changing. We've gone from $2 billion plus disasters a year to 18. As you pointed out, we've just broken through the 1.5 degrees danger barrier for climate change. So there are always going to be some local made-up excuse, but the fact of the matter is that the weather is changing. It is changing from climate change. That is what is changing the risk, and the insurance companies have to look forward and try to judge this, accurately for their stockholders and for their business model. And they're the ones who are saying across the country, we've got to back off. We've got to raise rates. We've got to get out. What the hell's going to happen here?
Senator Whitehouse, relative to insurance and regulation in California, I'm going to put on the screen, I'll read aloud for your benefit, something that the Wall Street Journal said on their editorial page. Insurers had already scrapped hundreds of thousands of policies and limited coverage in wildfire-prone areas. Democrats blame climate change, which has become an all-purpose excuse for any disaster relief failure. But the real insurance problem is that state regulators have barred insurers from charging premiums that fully reflect risks and costs. You've spent 2 years studying the issue. What do you say?
Doesn't make any sense. First of all, the Wall Street Journal editorial page is the mouthpiece of the fossil fuel industry, plain and simple. So it can't be trusted on anything that relates to fossil fuel interests. But even if you could raise prices, and Florida just went through a big so-called insurance reform in which they allowed a lot of prices to be raised, you hit unaffordability. You get people who are retired in Florida, they have an income, a pension that they're fine with, they've set up their finances so that they can live in their home, and suddenly in Florida, their property insurance prices have quadrupled. And now they can't afford it any longer. And going to get a job at Walmart doesn't bridge the gap. And so you get the same cascade. It's a little bit slower than the insurance companies fleeing, but it's still there as people can't afford the product. The underlying problem is the worsening risk, and that's the thing that we have to address.
So if I follow through your causal chain, the domino theory, in the end, won't we be left with people living in those areas that are prone toward weather, extreme weather brought about by climate change, who don't need a mortgage? And all the rest of us, will be blank out of luck because no bank will lend to us without insurance.
Yeah, if you're a fat cat Palm Beach billionaire, you're not worried about this, because when you get ready to sell your mansion, some other billionaire is going to come and buy it with basically for them change from the couch cushions. But if you're a plumber living in a development outside of Orlando who bought your house with a mortgage and you want to be able to sell that house because it's your most valuable financial resource for your family and nobody can get a mortgage on it to buy it from you, you're not going to find a billionaire coming for that property. You're not going to find a buyer. Property values will slide and then crash, and that cascades out into the rest of the economy, and it's 2008 all over again.
Quick reaction from you. As I said at the outset, while Washington dithers, the markets are about to sort this out.
Well, these insurance prices are going to make a difference. And for all the lying by the fossil fuel industry and for all the cowardice by the corporate community, they're now running into, on climate change, what I call a fiduciary horizon, where if they're not telling the truth, if they're not making the right investments to protect their company against climate risks, they're now liable to shareholders and other folks to whom they have a fiduciary relationship. So you're not just going to see insurance companies have to start telling the truth about and reacting to climate change. You're going to see major investment houses. It's going to move into the corporate sector in a whole new way. So greenwashing is fun for a while when you're a big corporation, but at some point your fiduciary liability is going to drive you to get real.
Senator Whitehouse, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Mike.